Donald Trump's return to the White House is bringing one key issue up that dominated India-US relations in a very big way during the first Trump administration, which was the issue of tariffs and trade. Donald Trump is widely seen as a wild card on this issue, someone who has threatened large tariffs and trade, as well as a zero-sum view of international economics. It's something that is causing some concern in India about his approach to the global economy. Joining me now is Dr. Rajat Kathuria, the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Shiv University, someone who's an expert on international economics, joining us to explain Donald Trump's approach to the economy, why it's causing some concern with India. Dr. Kathuria, thank you so much for joining us. Could I ask you to begin by just explaining why there has been such significant concern about Trump, his approach to trade? Why is he seen as such a wild card on these issues on economics and trade?
Sure. Thank you for having me. The reason for Mr. Trump's re-election causing a lot of uncertainty is because his nature is very unpredictable. I mean, his policies are quite unpredictable. But I must say one thing about the US system is that the institutions are fairly strong in terms of, in terms of what they've established already, what we say systemic institutions, so that no individual person can override what the institutions can do. But in Donald Trump's case, that sort of bit of that uncertain space becomes a little more. He calls India, for example, a tariff king at one point, and at other point he says India's leaders are the best and we can do business together. So it's this uncertainty that creates problems, because for economies, as you know, it's the uncertainty that is much more of a problem than even if you have policies which are not, let's say, favorable to you, but you can still work with them. But this uncertainty, the volatility, creates a lot of problems for India and, I dare say, for other countries. But on the trade relationship, I think between India and the United States, what happened in the past may not be a good predictor of what is likely to happen after January once he assumes power. Maybe it will be a different relationship. And there are reasons why I think it could be a different relationship going forward.
Right. Professor, if I could ask you, you said, the relationship in the past may not be what it will be going forward. Could I ask you to lay out to begin with, what was the relationship with Donald Trump? I think some of our audience has heard conversations about the generalized system of preferences, tariffs, beneficial tariff structures that India enjoyed that were removed, cases at the World Trade Organization, some tension on over trade. Could you begin by just explaining to people what the relationship was like between 2017 and 2021 between India and the United States when it came to this issue of trade?
Sure. So the genesis of the problem, of course, these are all the symptoms that you mentioned. The tariffs are a symptom of a deeper problem, as Donald Trump sees it. Removal of India from the GSP is another symptom of a problem, which is that India consistently ran a current account surplus with the United States. And the reason that Donald Trump sees current account surplus as a bad thing, and a number of people, in India as well, look at current account deficits that we run with certain countries like China as a bad thing. And there may be good reasons for doing that. But the reason why Donald Trump saw that current account surplus for India as a negative implication in the United States was not because US is less competitive in some sense, but he saw India as a high tariff country, not giving enough access to the US goods, not giving enough flexibility to intellectual property sales within India. And then on the other hand, India getting access or duty-free access because of the generalized system of preferences to the US market, resulting in this current account surplus. So I think these are symptoms of the problem of a current account surplus in his mind. But I don't think current account surpluses or current account deficits, which is the obverse of current account surpluses, I must pause here as an economist and mention that if the world is one and the world trades with one another, which it does, then not all countries simultaneously can run a current account deficit, or not all countries simultaneously can run a current account surplus. An economist will understand this because this is trade 101. But trying to explain this to, let's say, politicians whose major constituency is the popular vote, becomes difficult both in the United States and equally difficult in India. And therefore, I think it created a lot of problems. So, intellectual property, tariffs, market access, preferential market access to developing countries like India were creating problems in Mr. Trump's mind. And as India sort of portrays itself as this great, power, if not now, but in the future, and it elevates from a lower middle income country, sort of a lower income country to a lower middle income country, then Mr. Trump says that why should I give you these preferences or preferential market access? So those were sort of removed, which resulted in sort of increased tariffs that India faced in the US market.
Right. If I could also ask you then, over the last 4 years, how you've seen the Biden administration. I'm just trying to give our viewers a sense of what it was like under Trump between 2017 and 2021. We've had, of course, now 3 or 4 years of the Biden administration. Some of those, outstanding cases between India and the US were resolved. That were at the World Trade Organization. There's been cooperation on this new thing called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Broadly, it seems that there's been less tension on the India-US trade front, and economic trade, of course, has increased between the two countries. Would you broadly agree with that characterization, that things on the trade side have been easier?
Yes, I would broadly agree. Of course, one is that the trade increased because there was growth. Post-COVID, there was growth. And as incomes grew, trade increased. But also there was a greater sense of cooperation between the United States and India because of, I guess, one common factor during this period between 2017 and 21, post-COVID, was the rise of the continued inexorable rise of China, which I guess brought India and the United States closer together. I'm not going to be naive to suggest that there are no outstanding issues between India and the United States as far as trade is concerned. For example, if you were to look at the golden standard of what we could do with each other, i.e., could we sign a free trade agreement between India and the United States? And it's not such an outlandish thought, although some people will think it's way away in the future. But it's not such an outlandish thought because we have talked about an Indo-US free trade agreement. But that's really very, very far. All I'm saying is that there are outstanding issues on trade. There are outstanding issues in services. But what is happening is that there are even more graver problems that are emerging in the Indo-Pacific, that, the rise of China and the United States seeing China as not only a threat in terms of trade, but also seeing it as a geopolitical and a technological threat. And for this reason, some of these issues, I'm not saying they have been brushed under the carpet, but they haven't come to the fore yet. So I think in the last 4 years, India has enjoyed a more stable relationship, I would say, a less uncertain and a less volatile relationship with the United States than in the previous 4 years. But it's not to suggest that everything is hunky-dory. There are outstanding issues, but it's been a much more stable relationship.
Right. And if I could now ask you to talk about Donald Trump. On the campaign trail, one of his big statements was that he wants to slap a 60% tariff on goods coming in from China, or 20% tariff on goods coming in from the rest of the world. Of course, India would be presumably one of those countries. He called India a big abuser of the international trade system, also called India a tariff king. Could you explain, so there's a lot of concern then coming in, at least here in the media, talking about Donald Trump, about what this means for Trump's approach on trade. Could you give us a sense then of, this incoming Trump administration, how that's likely to shape up his view on India?
Yes, I think Trump, if in international trade terms, I would describe Trump much more as a mercantilist, although the United States as a whole would not be as mercantilist as Trump. But Trump, within the United States, and probably he will, his advisors will, of course, tell him that to eschew this political temptation of being mercantilist. But yes, at heart, I think he is a mercantilist. Whether he's playing to the gallery or not, one would know. But I think, if I were to use an English phrase, which is not very complimentary, but I don't mean anything negative. His bark could be worse than the bite. He could be saying these things sort of to gain popular attention, to attract votes, etc. But when it comes to actually doing business, it's not so easy to decouple from China. It's not so easy to raise tariffs. Of course, the WTO is dysfunctional, and primarily because of Mr. Trump himself. He refused to appoint somebody in the appellate body, and he's not been a believer of multilateralism. But it's much more difficult when it comes to the brass tacks. When two countries are tied at the hip, when you're importing so much from China and from other countries, it becomes very difficult to shock the system or disrupt the system into reshoring or friendshoring or diversifying of supply chains, which is on the agenda since COVID, and Mr. Trump will bring it to the fore once again. But I think it will be a slow process. It's not going to be a one-off thing that I'll impose 60% tariffs, because as I said, it's not that China doesn't have any leverage on the United States.
Sure.
Because it runs such a huge current account surplus with the United States, it also has ways, instruments to retaliate. Because after all, American goods are also sold in China. There's huge amounts of foreign direct investment in China. There are all the top Forbes 500, top 500 companies will have foreign investments, will be located in China. So I think it's going to be really difficult. So he'll have to walk a tightrope. Yes, there are abuses of the system from China. Yes, there are violations of standards which America embraces and empathizes with. Abuses of environmental standards, abuses of labor standards, abuses of intellectual property standards, and the Americans call it abuses, while people in China or even in India would say this is a part of our moving up the value chain. As we become more developed, we will begin to respect the standards, but it's too early in our development cycle to begin to respect all the environmental standards and competition standards that the West has already embraced. But the West did not embrace these standards immediately. It took them a while. Now they're trying to export these standards. And by West, I don't mean only the United States, but United States is one such player that wishes to export its own standards to the rest of the world, including on labor, including on environment, including on intellectual property, including on I would say public enterprises and government procurement. These are difficult things. These are challenges, not only for China, but I think there are much more graver challenges for India. So, and it's not, as I said, so there is sort of instrumentalities that China could use. I wouldn't say India has as much instrumentalities as China has over the United States, but it won't be so easy for Mr. Trump to go out there and impose these 60% tariffs. You go to a United States today, and you go to grocery stores, you go to malls, you go to buy electronics, you go to buy clothes, you go to buy spectacle, wherever you go in the United States. I mean, the malls are full of goods that have either directly been sourced from China or have components that are embedded in them that have been sourced from China or from other Southeast Asian countries. And consumers vote with their wallets.
Right.
Consumers would want inexpensive products, and therefore there is a huge demand for Chinese products, because not only have they increased quality, but they have also remained a little more competitive. So I would sort of say that this could be Mr. Trump's political strategy or election campaign strategy. There may be an increase in tariff, but 60% to my mind seems too high. And it's like, it would be like cutting your nose to spite your face. I mean, you would be harming the United States also at the same time.
Right. Professor, while you're talking about India and Donald Trump's approach to India during his second administration, there have been some conversations about that with Trump now back in the White House, India will have to make or consider making more concessions on trade, which in some ways may not be a bad thing, because, of course, there is a sense that India has erected more tariffs and has, on average, gotten a little more protectionist. And, of course, our Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal has acquired a reputation for being one of the world's tougher trade negotiators. Can you see a little bit about how India will likely look at this? That look, there is likely to be some more pressure on trade and economic issues from the Trump administration. Do you think India is ready to make some more concessions? Do you have a sense of where it might be willing to make those concessions on trade and economics?
Well, I think so. I think so. And it might be a good thing as you say it. And in fact, I myself, and not only but I think somebody that this administration in India looks upon as a respected and credible trade economist, who's now the chair of the Finance Commission, Dr. Arvind Panagaria, has been critical of the government's increase of tariffs or increase in protection over the last few years. And there's been a steady increase in protection across certain sectors. And that, of course, has been based on the fact that increase in protection will allow us to make in India much more. But I think that's a wrong instrument. That's sort of an incorrect policy that we're using. But also we're giving in some sense, to domestic pressures. And those domestic pressures came to the fore when India didn't sign the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. And those domestic pressures really came to the fore. So I think India should, and it's a good thing that Mr. Trump will put pressure on India to reduce tariffs so that we can become more competitive domestically. I think that is a route to becoming more competitive. And I think that will be a good thing. We'll reduce tariffs on some electronic items. There are inverted duty structures that still exists, and that might be reversed. There are some items that we've put, for example, furniture, etc., that we've put tariffs on. And I think reduction of tariffs in general would be good for the economy because they will add competitive pressure. My mind goes back to 1991, and some of your viewers may not know what happened in 1991, but India had the delicensing regime put in place in 1991. And at that time, there was this body that was created by Indian industrialists called the Bombay Club. And they had claimed that they would completely be destroyed and damaged by the influx of foreign competition. And nothing of that sort happened. And, you look at the industries that India has been able to establish post 1991 because of liberalization. Industries like the telecom, hardware industry, the automobile sector, the pharmaceutical sector, they are thriving and they've become world beaters in some sense. And that could never have happened had we remained protectionist, had we not done away with the license Raj. Because if you are protectionist and you have this large domestic market to sell to, why the hell should I be competitive? What is the reason I should be competitive? There is no sort of motivation for any company to be competitive. So I think one has to deconstruct what the political sort of inspiration for companies in India is, and sort of deconstruct what their political statements are versus what their genuine problems are. And I think Indian industry has come a long way since 1991. So changing, tariff lines or reducing tariff lines now from certain industries in certain sectors is not going to harm Indian industry as much as the industry itself claims. On the other hand, it might make it more competitive for sectors that use those components as backward linkages to then either sell in the domestic market or in the export market. That's the way China did it. That's the way ASEAN countries have done it. And that's the way Korea has done it. And now to claim, protection or infant industry protection after 1991, I think it doesn't make sense for India. Now we have to become a part of global value chains. We have to, pull our weight in global markets. And there's no point always trying to take the refuge of tariffs. Of course, there are other measures, non-tariffs, etc., which I haven't spoken of. But I think it's time that we eschew the temptation of using tariffs as make in India and look at other means to make in India, easing business, reducing regulatory burdens, easing compliances, making India truly a one market, like we've done through the implementation of GST, making transport and logistics easier. I think that's a much better way to make in India rather than to periodically tinker with increasing tariffs across certain tariff lines to protect certain industries.
Right. Professor, you've given me the ideal opportunity to segue into my question about Make in India. There was a sense that the Biden administration was a little more understanding of India's goals when it came to Make in India, was willing to work with the Indian government as well as the American companies to drive a lot of investments, applied materials or semiconductor firms or General Electric, American defense companies. The idea was that the Biden administration was understanding of India's concerns on trying to build more in India, shoring up supply chains much more easily. There was this initiative on critical and emerging technologies, which would involve more close technology cooperations or advanced technology with India and the United States. But with Donald Trump, there seems to be a slightly different view where he wants, of course, the Biden administration also wanted to bring American jobs back, but with the Americans, with the new American administration with Donald Trump, there seems to be at least a sense or this fear that perhaps they will not be as supportive of India's desires to get American firms to come to India to manufacture in India as the Biden administration was, and that could in fact then end up hampering India's Make in India efforts. Do you have any sympathy with this fear? Do you think it's incorrect? Your view on this?
I think Mr. Trump will be a hard bargainer. He will bargain much more, but I don't think there will be a reversal. There might be a slowdown, but I don't think there'll be a reversal of this policy. It's like, having come out so far, as Shakespeare said in one of his plays, we've come out so far in crime that going back and going forward will be equally onerous. I think in some sense, Trump will negotiate harder. But I think the major factor that will guide the future decisions is not really the India-US relation. It is the US-China relation and the seeking of alternative markets to sort of diversify into. And India, provides that opportunity of diversification away from China. As I said in my previous remarks that, diversifying away from China is going to be really hard because China is embedded deeply into global value chains, including electronic value chains. So it'll be difficult to do. But I think two factors will be at play. One is, how do US-China relations emerge? And if the force towards diversification continues and gains momentum or intensifies, then that's going to be a positive for India.
Right.
However, the negative for India will be that Mr. Trump will play a hard bargainer. As it is, to get semiconductor packaging unit into India, we've had to pay a huge amount of subsidy because remember, nobody is willing to come to India without that huge subsidy package. And I think the estimates are that we paid about 2 billion plus in subsidies to attract Micron into India. So there has been a subsidy that India has given. Maybe Mr. Trump will bargain a little harder on other issues as well, because all issues will come on the table when Mr. Trump is in power. But I think both those factors will be at play. My own assessment is that there will be no reversal of these investments that have already come in. There may be a slowdown on new investments, but as India begins to emerge as a serious hardware manufacturer, although in the not the really nano or advanced chips of the future, the older sort of bigger chips, as India begins to emerge, and combine that with India's big market and combine that with India's human capital strength and the fact that there is already so much more R&D that is already happening in India. So India has become a hub for a lot of R&D for global companies. So combining all of that, there are some positives, there are some negatives, but I think on balance, Mr. Trump is not going to reverse it. He'll bargain hard. And I think the core or the key determinant is going to be how the US-China relationship evolves, especially in innovation and electronics.
Right. And Professor, if I may close with my final question, which is on the US-China relationship. The idea is that India has in some senses been a beneficiary of the fact that China is increasingly being seen as uninvestable. Of course, the domestic economic climate in China has not been fantastic over the last couple of years. There is, of course, the added American economic pressure, which could get worse after Donald Trump takes office. And so there's the sense that India will benefit out of companies looking to redirect some investments away from China into countries like India. So that's the positive side of the ledger. There's the sense that India will benefit from that. But on the negative side, there's been some concern that, look, the world economy has already had a difficult time after the pandemic, after the war in Ukraine. Now the conflict in the Middle East has disrupted global shipping. Do we really need another conflict between the United States and China on trade and economics? Will that not already make the already fraught global economic situation even worse? So there are two sides to this emerging debate on whether, in fact, greater US-China tensions are in India's economic benefit or are they on the negative side of the ledger. Could I ask you a little bit about how you see these tensions playing out between the United States and China? Do you believe it will be beneficial for India, or do you believe that, in fact, the headwinds that sort of conflict will generate will only make it more difficult for India in the global economy?
I think there will be some positives for India, but for India to be able to absorb those positives, and this is not the first time, and this is not the first global shock that has rendered India an alternative or provided India an opportunity. This is probably the third time. The global economic crisis in 2008, India, people were talking about India as the next manufacturing destination. Then came COVID, and India again, people again being started talking about India as the next destination. And now with this US-China trade war and with Trump coming back into becoming president is another opportunity for India to leverage. And I think India, to be able to completely leverage this opportunity, I think domestic reform is crucial. And I've written, a lot of people have written about it. I've written about it personally. I mean, we need to do domestic reform. Everybody complains about investing in India, that it takes time, the red tape is very high, the logistics are a problem. And you get clearances at the center, but state level has its own issues of clearances. I can go on as an economist telling you what the problems that investors face. So I think that's where India putting its own house in order is absolutely imperative to be able to get in all those investments. And China, in some sense, has been able to punch above its weight by being a country with a per capita income which is 5 times less than the United States. So if you look at per capita terms, it's now dominating the global discourse on trade, or almost dominating the global discourse on trade. And in some sense, in innovation, in electric vehicles, in solar panels, it's become the world leader. And they say that storage could be China's leap into becoming the economic hegemon. So given all of that, I think the opportunity for India exists. China will emerge. The opportunity does exist, but we need to put our house in order. How will the US-China relationship play out? I think that's a much more difficult question to answer. I mean, both countries want to be. I mean, when the United States was the single hegemon in some sense, when it was a unipolar world in terms of trade, everything seems to be hunky-dory. They admitted China into the World Trade Organization, feeling that if China becomes a part of the World Trade Organization, it would become a good actor. Given that China has its own ambitions of becoming a global superpower, and being a hegemon as much as the United States wishes to be, it's a much more difficult question. Will the United States accommodate the rise of China? Will it impose itself? If it imposes itself, then I think India stands to gain a lot more. But if it accommodates China and says, okay, we make peace with another rising power, economic rising power, we'll make peace with them and we'll do trade with them, then I think India's position will not improve as much, or India will not benefit from the fallout of the US-China relationship as much. So the bottom line is continued tension between United States and China, where United States wishes to remain the hegemon and the innovation lead of the world. If that continues and that tension continues, India could benefit, provided it puts its own house in order. If US accommodates China and sees China as having arrived on the world stage as another economic power and accommodates it, so it becomes a bipolar world, then I think the opportunities for India to emerge will be a lot more difficult.
Understood. Professor Kathuria, I'm obliged to you for spending some time with us explaining the opportunities as well as the challenges that will come up from the Trump administration that's going to take office in January next year for India and the opportunities it presents for the Indian economy. I'm obliged to you again for sharing your time, and to our viewers for watching us on India Today Global.